Hey guys, tonight we're going to gently ease ourselves into the rather squishy world of ancient Mesopotamian mail. That's right before email, before pigeons. Before even proper paper, if you wanted to send a message, you basically played in the mud. Picture it, you're chilling by the mighty Euphrates River, the sun is baking everything to a golden brown crisp. And you decide you really need to send a memo to your business partner in the next town about that shipment of dates. No crisp linen paper for you. Oh no, you grab a lump of wet clay. Yeah, this is the kind of ancient civilization detail that might just bore you straight into slumber, but in the best possible way. It's history designed specifically not to keep you up thinking about existential dread, but to lull you into thinking about damp earth and pointy sticks. It sounds incredibly uncomfortable and inefficient by today's standards, and frankly, you probably wouldn't last a day trying to navigate ancient Mesopotamia's postal system without getting dust in your eyes or dropping a soggy letter. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, feel free to drop a comment letting me know where you're winding down from tonight and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine if you can stepping back, maybe 4,000 or 5,000 years, way back, before TikTok dances, before lukewarm coffee, even before those questionable medieval hygiene tips we touched upon last week. We're standing mentally at least in what many historians call the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia, that fertile stretch of land hugged by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, roughly modern-day Iraq and parts of surrounding countries. This place often swelteringly hot and incredibly dusty unless you were right by the river, in which case potentially rather muddy was a hotbed, literally and figuratively for innovation. Think farming early cities, complex social structures, and yep, you guessed it, really complicated ways of writing things down and sending them. Now, the crucial defining element of Mesopotamia was its environment. Not dense forests, not rocky mountainside villages. Think wide, relatively flat plains fed by those two mighty rivers. What does this kind of landscape give you in abundance water if you're lucky with irrigation and mud? Loads and loads of incredibly useful fine-grained clay-rich mud. This wasn't just dirt, it was the raw material for their entire built environment. They built houses out of sun-baked mud bricks. They built towering ziggurats, those step pyramids, primarily from mud brick. So when it came to finding a material to record things, a surface you could make permanent, something durable that you didn't have to import at great expense from far-off lands. Well, clay was right there. Abundant. Free. Shapeable. It was the original sustainable resource long before anyone even used the word. You scoop it out, you process it a little, and boom. You've got yourself a potential writing surface. Trying to find papyrus here. Forget about it, wrong environment entirely. Lumber for wood scrolls, scarce and precious. Animal hides for parchment. Too difficult and expensive to process on a large scale for everyday memos. Clay wasn't just an option. It was pretty much the only truly practical one for widespread use in a place like Sumer or Babylon. So, the purpose of using clay for letters and documents grew organically from this reality. They weren't writing romantic poetry to slip under someone's door, though personal letters did exist. The primary need for written communication in early Mesopotamia was administrative and economic. Remember, these were burgeoning city-states. Complex economies were developing. People were trading goods, barley dates, livestock, textiles. Kings and priests were managing huge estates, overseeing public works. Collecting taxes. Yes, taxes existed even then. Isn't history comforting? This kind of activity generates paperwork. Lots of it. Imagine needing to record how much grain farmer Nabu delivered, how many sheep went to market the terms of a trade deal instructions from a city governor to a subordinate in an outlying village. You needed a reliable way to write this down, something that wouldn't just crumble to dust if you looked at it funny, and crucially something that couldn't be easily altered without leaving obvious traces. Enter the clay tablet. These weren't delicate little things. When you picture an ancient letter, banish the image of a thin, flexible sheet. Think more like a sturdy biscuit, or perhaps a slightly thick tile. They varied in size depending on the length of the message or document. Some were tiny, maybe an inch or two across for short notes or labels. Others could be quite large, heavy things the size of dinner plates for official decrees or lengthy accounts. But they shared one crucial feature. They started as soft, pliable clay on which you could make impressions and could then be hardened to preserve those impressions permanently. Using clay offered some inherent advantages besides just being readily available. Once dry, or especially if baked in a kiln like firing pottery, though, simple sun drying was also common. If less permanent, a clay tablet becomes incredibly durable. Think about all the ancient civilizations we study. Many left behind monumental architecture, pottery, perhaps metal objects. But things written on perishable materials like wood, fabric, or early forms of paper like papyrus from Egypt, which sometimes traded with Mesopotamia but wasn't indigenous, largely vanish over time, biodegrading into nothingness. Clay, however, if it survives being trampled or dissolved back into mud before it dries or is baked, it can last for millennia. This is why archaeology has unearthed hundreds of thousands, maybe even 1 million or more. Estimates vary wildly of these clay documents. They offer an unparalleled window into the daily life, administration, religion, and economics of these ancient societies. It's like finding the recycle bin from an entire civilization. Okay, maybe that's too mundane. Let's say finding their filing cabinets mostly intact. But using clay had its own unique set of challenges and dictated the very form of their writing and communication. Something we'll delve into much more. You couldn't really write on soft clay with a pen tip as we think of it today. The soft clay would just gum up or smear. You needed to impress marks, push a tool into it. This constraint led to the development of cuneiform script, which literally means wedge-shaped, because that's what the impressions looked like. Trying to sign your name like a flourish. Not happening. You're making deliberate presses and strokes. It's less like elegant cursive and more like carefully pushing geometric shapes into something resembling slightly too firm dough. This process naturally required a very specific set of skills and tools, which meant writing was far from universal. Most people weren't literate. One thing that historians still debate is the precise point in history and location within Mesopotamia where the first purely administrative writing shifted into genuinely personal letters. We have examples very early on of records lists and bureaucratic notes. But figuring out when someone first scratched out a note on clay just to say, "Hey, Dad arrived safe, weather is hot," is trickier. The earliest writing seems overwhelmingly tied to accounting and management, essential tools for complex temple economies in early states. It was about keeping track of stuff and directing activities, not idle chit-chat or spreading gossip. Though surely gossip was still spread, just probably the old-fashioned way by shouting it across the market square or whispering secrets over flatbread and beer, which, speaking of ancient food, required its own set of accounting meaning. Even beer inventories ended up on clay. So as you picture the scene, hot sun adobe walls, perhaps the faint bleating of sheep or the distant drone of a street vendor, understand that everywhere underfoot and available was the future of communication for millennia. Clay wasn't just building material, it was their paper, their storage drive, their message board, preparing it correctly, shaping it just so, learning the unique skill to market. These were fundamental parts of early Mesopotamian society. It set the stage for everything from casual memos to royal decrees, and even epic literature, all etched into earth itself. Next, we'll sink our hands deeper into the actual making of these remarkable communication devices. Get ready to get virtually messy. All right, so you've got this fantastic mud available, perfect for squishing into shape, but using it as a writing surface that wasn't like grabbing a pencil and notepad from your kitchen drawer. This was a highly skilled profession, a craft that required years of dedicated study and practice. We're talking about becoming a scribe. In ancient Mesopotamia, scribes were kind of a big deal. They held keys to power. The power of literacy, the power of organizing complex systems, and perhaps most importantly, the power to decide exactly how much grain you owed in taxes, which is a lot of power. If you wanted a stable, relatively comfortable career path that didn't involve sweating in a field or fighting invaders, becoming a scribe was your best bet. Assuming you were from a family with enough means or connections to afford the training. This wasn't an everyman's pursuit. Literacy rates, as in most ancient societies, were incredibly low. You were joining an elite club. So how did one join this prestigious mud writing club? You went to school, of course, not your typical cozy classroom. Probably more like a designated courtyard or building attached to a temple or palace, possibly incredibly noisy with lots of people practicing sounds or copying texts. These schools were known as Eduba, which means something like tablet house. Training started young, potentially as a child, and could last for many, many years. We're talking maybe 10 years, possibly more, essentially from childhood into young adulthood. Imagine going to elementary, middle, high school, and getting a master's degree all just to write on mud. And unlike modern schooling where you might debate the literary merit of Shakespeare, your day-to-day homework was endlessly copying lists. Lists of signs, lists of words categorized in fascinating ways like every kind of tree, every kind of animal, every kind of object you could possibly think of, lists of gods, lists of places. You copied legal texts, administrative documents, mathematical problems. You'd copy them onto a practice tablet, show it to your teacher, likely scrape it smooth again to reuse the clay if you were lucky, or maybe discard it and start fresh with a new lump if clay was abundant. Historians have actually found caches of these school tablets, little roundish or rectangular lumps covered in a student's shaky, uncertain script mistakes and all. It's oddly poignant to think that ancient Mesopotamian school kids probably felt the exact same frustration with practicing their ABCs, or rather their wedge-shaped marks, as kids do today. Some tablets even describe school life, mentioning stern teachers and disciplinary actions, though. Whether they swatted students with a ruler or a well-aimed mud clod isn't entirely clear. Hopefully the former. Your most crucial tool beyond the clay itself was the stylus. This wasn't a pen nib or a brush. It was typically made from a reed readily available along the riverbanks. These reeds were cut and shaped to have different working ends. The critical part was the corner. By pressing the corner of the cut reed into the soft clay at different angles, and with varying pressure, scribes could produce the wedge-shaped marks that characterize cuneiform. You could also use the flat end of the stylus to make longer strokes, or even a circular end in the very earliest forms of the script to impress dots or circles for numbers. But the definitive mark was the wedge. Picture holding a sturdy chopstick, or maybe a popsicle stick cut at a slant. You hold it just right, press firmly into the yielding clay, lift, rotate, slightly press again. Each syllable, word, or idea, depending on the complexity of the script at that point in time, was built up by combining a series of these carefully placed wedges and lines. Think about the muscle memory required. You're not just sketching or painting, you are impressing with deliberate force. Too gentle and the mark isn't deep enough. Too hard and you distort the clay. You need precision. You're learning potentially hundreds, eventually thousands of these cuneiform signs. Each sign could represent a whole word or a syllable sometimes, even multiple things depending on context, which is part of what makes deciphering them such brain-straining work for modern scholars. So you'd practice making perfect wedges, then combining wedges into signs, then combining signs into words or names, then copying entire texts flawlessly. The teacher wouldn't be like, express yourself. Your main goal was rote memorization and perfect reproduction. Boring. Possibly. Effective for training administrators and record keepers. Absolutely. Scribes weren't just copy machines, though. That was a core skill. As they advanced, they learned complex accounting procedures, administrative formulae, how to draft a legal contract or a royal decree, and sometimes even literature and history. The really good scribes could work in temples managing vast agricultural estates and tribute. They could work in palaces, advising kings, writing down laws like the famous Law Code of Hammurabi, which was written down by scribes and managing state correspondence. They could work for wealthy merchants keeping ledgers of complex international trade deals that stretched from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. Their skills were essential for running any kind of large-scale organized activity. They were the accountants, the lawyers, the civil servants, the historians, and sometimes the poets of their day all rolled into one, united by their mastery of that unassuming lump of clay and a pointy stick. Historians still argue whether becoming a scribe offered a genuine path for social mobility for people from lower classes, or if it was predominantly restricted to the sons of existing elites. Scribes passing the profession down through generations like a family business. Evidence exists for both. Some texts mention scribe fathers and scribe sons. Other documents hint at people starting in different trades but moving into scribe work. It likely varied over time and between different cities. But regardless, once you were in, you were part of a respected, skilled group that lubricated the wheels of Mesopotamian civilization. Your day might involve sitting cross-legged in a warm courtyard, patiently shaping clay and pressing symbols far away from the physical grind of the fields, or the dangers of caravan routes. It was quiet, it was focused. It required immense concentration, and it all started with preparing that perfect lump of mud, which it turns out wasn't as simple as just digging a hole by the river. That's up next. Okay, so you've committed years of your life to the arduous task of becoming a master of the stylus and the wedge-shaped mark. But even the most skilled scribe in ancient Mesopotamia couldn't do much without the fundamental ingredient clay. And not just any mud scooped off the street, though that might work in a pinch for quick practice. If you were drafting a formal document, a letter of state, or anything meant to last or look respectable, the clay needed preparation. Just like a painter needs quality canvas or a chef needs fresh ingredients, a scribe needed properly processed clay. Getting it right was surprisingly important. The best source naturally was along the riverbanks of the Tigris and Euphrates, or near the canals they dug to irrigate the land. Riverbeds are excellent sources of fine-grained clay sediment deposited over millennia. But scooping it out wasn't the end of the process. Raw clay straight from the riverbed contains impurities. Little pebbles grit organic matter like roots or bits of leaves. Imagine trying to make crisp, precise wedge marks on a surface, littered with tiny stones that deflect your stylus or flecks of debris that leave unsightly bumps. Not ideal. So the clay needed cleaning and refining. The basic process involved levigation. This sounds fancy, but it's a simple ancient technique still used by potters today. You take your rough clay, ideally broken into smaller lumps, and put it in a large container with a lot of water. Then you stir it thoroughly, or perhaps stomp on it with bare feet, presumably making a satisfying squishing sound, essentially creating a clay water slurry. The heavier impurities like stones and coarse sand will sink relatively quickly to the bottom. The fine clay particles suspended in the water stay floating for much longer. You let the mixture settle for a period. The specific time probably depended on experience and desired quality. Then carefully you pour off the cloudy clay-rich water into a second container, leaving the settled grit behind in the first. This second container holds your refined clay slurry. But it's still a slurry, basically clay soup. You need something you can mold with your hands, so the next step was drying. The clay slurry was left to sit. The water would slowly evaporate off, perhaps under the Mesopotamian sun. Efficient but risky if a dust storm blew through, or sometimes in a shady, airy spot, to ensure slower, more even drying. As the water evaporates, the clay becomes thicker, transitioning from a liquid suspension to a usable plastic state. The kind of clay you can comfortably mold, knead, and impress marks into. The process needed to be controlled. If it dried too quickly, it might become brittle or develop cracks, ruining its usability. It needed to reach a perfect consistency, soft and pliable enough to easily take impressions without cracking, but firm enough to hold its shape. Think of it like kneading bread dough. Too sticky and wet is bad, too dry and crumbly is also bad. There's a sweet spot of plasticity. The amount of preparation depended on the intended use. Simple school tablets for ephemeral practice. Maybe less stringent refining, a royal inscription, or a critically important legal contract. You wanted the cleanest, smoothest clay possible for durability and appearance. The level of refinement and skill in preparation contributed directly to the quality of the final tablet. Imagine writing the deed to a major piece of land on clay that was full of pebbles and might just disintegrate next week. That wasn't good for business or record-keeping longevity. Some workshops or institutions likely had dedicated individuals or slaves whose primary job was just sourcing and preparing clay day in and day out, ensuring a consistent supply of high-quality material for the scribes. It was the invisible labor that supported the visible act of writing. We even have some tantalizing, albeit sparse references to clay quality in text. Occasionally, texts differentiate between types of clay used or note where good clay sources were located. This mundane detail highlights that it wasn't just considered generic mud, but a raw material with variations in quality that mattered to the people using it. This focused attention on material suggests a certain level of sophistication, even in the preparatory steps. Think of ancient builders assessing types of stone or farmers evaluating soil. They had an intimate knowledge of their natural resources and their properties. Historians still argue whether different city-states or time periods had standardized recipes or methods for clay preparation, or if it was more down to the individual workshop's practice or regional clay properties. Was there a famous Sumerian white clay known for its smoothness? Or did Babylonian scribes prefer a certain reddish-brown kind? Likely practices varied, and archaeological evidence sometimes shows differences in clay color and texture depending on the site and period. But the basic principles of suspending in water, letting impurities settle, and controlled drying would have been universal. It was the foundational skill that made all the writing, all the administrative genius possible. It's kind of relaxing to think about, isn't it? Squishing mud, waiting patiently for water to evaporate, feeling the texture change? Perhaps not the most exciting historical detail, but crucial. Without that properly prepared, perfectly plastic lump, there are no wedge marks, no letters, no Hammurabi's code, just wet dirt, which, while foundational, wasn't great for sending messages across the ancient world. Getting that smooth writing surface ready is what comes next. All right, your refined clay has dried to that perfect, malleable state. Not too sticky, not too crumbly. It feels just right in your hands. Now comes the relatively simple but essential task of shaping it into a usable writing surface. Forget your flat rectangular modern tablets like an iPad. Mesopotamian clay tablets came in various shapes and sizes, but the core idea was forming a manageable piece of clay that a scribe could comfortably hold or place on a surface and impress marks upon. The most common shape was rectangular, sometimes with slightly rounded corners. To create one, a scribe or perhaps an assistant would take a lump of prepared clay and work it in their hands. Think of it like kneading dough one more time, or maybe shaping a patty for a burger. The goal is to eliminate air bubbles, which could cause cracking during drying, and to achieve a uniform consistency. You'd gently pat it, squeeze it, and fold it upon itself. Then you'd press and flatten the lump onto a surface, or perhaps just against your hand, to create a generally flat shape. For standard documents or letters, they aimed for a roughly rectangular form size to fit the expected amount of text. Thickness could vary. Generally, they weren't paper thin, maybe anywhere from a ½ inch to an inch or more thick. There were also variations. Small round tablets were often used for basic school exercises or simple receipts, like little clay cookies. Cones were sometimes used for foundation deposits in buildings, recording the king's name and the building project. Cylinders were used for seals, as we'll discuss later, but sometimes larger clay cylinders or even prisms were used for important historical texts like royal annals or literary works offering multiple sides for longer inscriptions. But for the everyday letter or administrative record, the rectangular shape predominated. Shaping the tablet involved a few simple steps. You start with your lump of clay, knead it a bit, then you might flatten it on a smooth surface. Perhaps a wooden board, a stone slab, or even just a clean patch of floor or mat. You press it out, smoothing the surfaces with your hands or a simple tool to create two main writing faces. The edges were often beveled or slightly rounded off. A sharp corner on a clay tablet wouldn't last long and would be uncomfortable to handle. Some scribes seem to have used a straight edge tool, perhaps made of wood or bone, to help square up the sides and create neat edges, especially for more formal documents. Others might have simply patted and squeezed it into shape by hand. The key was creating a relatively flat, smooth surface that was thick enough not to easily break but thin enough to handle conveniently. Think about the sensory experience, the cool, slightly damp feel of the clay in your hands, the gentle squishing sounds, the concentration required to get a uniform thickness without warping the shape. This was a hands-on process, literally shaping communication out of the earth. It was a rhythmic, perhaps even calming activity. Imagine doing this thousands of times over your career. The feel of the clay would become utterly familiar, its readiness to accept impressions immediately apparent. It was perhaps a quiet, meditative moment before the focused intensity of the writing itself began. You are not just molding mud. You are forming the physical vessel that will carry information instructions or records across space and time. This humble lump will potentially outlast empires carrying its quiet message across millennia simply because it is made of dirt. Getting the surface smooth was also crucial. Any bumps, divots, or rough patches would interfere with the clean impression of the stylus and make the text harder to read. Scribal tools weren't limited to the stylus for writing. They might have had scrapers or small smoothing paddles to get the faces just right before they started inscribing. The ideal tablet surface was uniform and fine-grained, ready to receive the sharp imprint of the cuneiform wedges. This care and preparation meant that even very ancient tablets found thousands of years later can still retain incredibly crisp impressions of the writing, looking almost as fresh as the day they were inscribed, assuming they weren't water damaged before hardening. Historians still argue whether the consistent dimensions and shapes sometimes found in tablet archives from specific institutions or periods indicate standardized molds or just incredibly consistent manual technique by skilled laborers or scribes themselves. While complex molds weren't impossible, the variations observed suggest that most tablet shaping was likely a manual process relying on practiced hands rather than uniform tools. The little differences in size, thickness, and edge finish are part of the charm and the challenge of studying these artifacts. Each one has the subtle marks of the human hands that formed it. So your perfect rectangle of prepared clay is ready. It sits on your workspace, waiting. The next step, the actual writing, transforms this simple lump into a message, a record, a piece of history. And that involves understanding those peculiar wedge-shaped marks. Okay, the stage is set. You have your perfectly kneaded lump-free clay tablet shaped just so. You have your sharpened reed stylus cut to the correct angles. You are a scribe ready to commit words, or initially more like ideas or numbers, to immortality, or at least semi-permanence on baked earth. But you can't just draw pictures willy-nilly, not anymore. You need to use the script. The unique writing system developed in Mesopotamia is known as cuneiform. The name itself comes from the Latin word cuneus, meaning wedge, which perfectly describes the characteristic shape of the marks pressed into the clay. Cuneiform is one of the oldest writing systems in the world, right up there with Egyptian hieroglyphs, and its invention was a monumental leap for human civilization. Think about the early attempts at record keeping. Before complex writing, people might use tokens, little clay shapes representing quantities of goods. A cone might be a measure of grain, a sphere a measure of oil, etc. You'd put the tokens inside a clay ball or on a string, perhaps, mark the outside to show how many were inside. Useful for basic accounting, but limiting. If you wanted to say Nabu owes 2 measures of grain delivered next month. Tokens didn't quite cut it. You needed symbols to represent things, actions, and ideas with more nuance. The earliest cuneiform signs evolved from these simpler tokens or pictographs, drawings of objects. An early sign for barley, for example, might literally look like a stalk of barley. The sign for an ox might look vaguely bovine. This logographic stage, where each symbol represents a whole word or concept, was helpful but required knowing thousands of different symbols. Imagine having a separate symbol for every single noun and every single verb in your language. That's a lot to remember. The genius innovation that made cuneiform more flexible and ultimately led to its long lifespan, was the shift towards phonetization. This is where the symbols started representing sounds, specifically syllables rather than just whole words. So a symbol that originally meant Water might start being used because its spoken name sounded like the first syllable of another word, even if that word had nothing to do with water. This breakthrough meant that with a much smaller number of symbols, a few hundred for syllabic cuneiform rather than thousands for logographic scribes could represent a much wider range of words, including abstract concepts, names, grammatical elements, and foreign words. This shift allowed for writing complex prose, narratives, laws, and yes, personal letters that expressed actual sentences rather than just lists of objects. So your stylus isn't just drawing. It's creating deliberate combinations of wedge shapes to represent sounds or words from languages like Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, and even Hittite, among others, because cuneiform script was adopted and adapted by numerous cultures throughout the ancient Near East over literally thousands of years. This is a mainstream historical fact. Cuneiform script was used across a vast geographic area for a remarkably long time, evolving significantly from its earliest forms. Let's look at how the wedges were made. A scribe typically held the stylus, usually a reed cut with a triangular or quadrilateral cross-section, and pressed the corner into the soft clay. By pressing the corner point first and then dragging or simply pressing the body of the stylus deeper, they created a wedge, varying the angle of the stylus relative to the tablet surface, and the pressure applied created different types of wedges: vertical wedges, horizontal wedges, and oblique wedges pointing diagonally. They could also use the end of the stylus to make circular or semicircular marks, though the pure wedge became dominant over time. Combinations and arrangements of these fundamental wedge types formed the individual cuneiform signs. A single sign might consist of just one or two wedges, while others were intricate clusters of 10 or more carefully placed impressions. It's a very ordered, almost mathematical script in appearance, compared to, say, flowing Egyptian hieroglyphs or cursive alphabets. It looks precise and deliberate because it had to be. Every wedge mattered for clarity. A quirky tidbit about cuneiform practice when teaching students, or perhaps even in rapid note-taking scribes, sometimes used lentil-shaped tablets that fit neatly in the hand. On one side, the teacher might write a sign or line of text. On the other, the student would copy it. The teacher's side might be clearly marked or separated by a line from the student's attempt. It's like having a built-in copybook practice pad that could be erased by smoothing the clay again. Simple, effective, and leaves us with delightful little historical artifacts showing the learning process thousands of years ago. Now, about that open scholarly debate, historians still argue whether the adoption of syllabic writing in cuneiform was a sudden aha moment, a deliberate invention recognizing the phonetic potential, or a much more gradual evolution driven by the increasing difficulty of representing a complex, evolving language solely with logograms. Was there one genius who figured it out, or did necessity and many scribes fiddling with their reed styluses lead to this major linguistic leap over generations? Evidence suggests a long, gradual transition with different places and scribes adopting phonetic elements at different rates, but pinning down the exact timeline and motivation is challenging. It's hard to interview people from 4000 BC after all. So the scribe sits with the stylus. Their refined clay tablet is ready. They have thousands of hours of practice embedded in their muscle memory. Now, with focus and patience, they begin impressing the wedges, translating the ephemeral thoughts or dictated words into durable patterns on earth. This quiet, rhythmic process of pressing, and lifting, transforming soft clay into communication is where the letter truly comes into being. So, your hand holds the reed stylus shaped just so, and in front of you lies the freshly prepared clay tablet, cool and damp. Now the magic happens. You position the stylus corner against the soft surface. It's a different kind of writing than we know. Not gliding ink across paper, but pressing shape into yielding earth. The fundamental movement is a deliberate jab, a precise press of the stylus, corner and edge into the clay. By varying the angle, you get different kinds of wedges. Hold the corner perpendicular to the surface and press downwards, pulling slightly, you get a vertical wedge. Tilt it 90 degrees press and pull sideways, a horizontal wedge. Angle it somewhere in between oblique wedges. You learn sequences of these presses. It's like learning choreography for your hand and wrist. A single cuneiform sign isn't just one wedge. It's often a cluster of several wedges arranged in a specific pattern. Each pattern is like a mini symbol carefully constructed from these basic strokes. So you might make 3 horizontal wedges stacked vertically, then a vertical wedge next to them, maybe with an oblique one attached. Your hand movements are precise, economical. You want to make clear, deep impressions, but not press so hard that you crack the thin layer you've smoothed onto the tablet, or distort the shapes of the surrounding signs. It requires steady pressure, consistent angle, and a rhythmic hand. Think of it like learning to use a tiny, very specific stamp set, but you're building every design stroke by stroke. You work systematically across the tablet surface. In the very earliest forms of cuneiform, the text was often arranged in columns read downwards, sometimes from right to left across the tablet. Over time, the orientation changed. By the time cuneiform was well established for languages like Akkadian and Babylonian, the standard practice was to write in rows read from left to right across the tablet surface, starting at the top and moving downwards, just like how most of us read today. This mainstream historical fact, the shift from vertical columns to horizontal rows and changing reading direction, is evident when you compare very early pictographic tablets to later cuneiform texts. Why the change? Possibly because it became easier to write left to right with a hand holding a stylus, without smudging the previously written text, which was less of an issue when writing in downward columns, especially on earlier tablets rotated 90 degrees from later practice. But even writing left to right, your hand had to hover slightly or rest on an already written area that was less susceptible to smudging than soft, fresh clay. One of the big challenges of writing on clay, no easy erase button. Unlike a pencil where you can rub out a mistake, if you messed up a sign or a whole word on soft clay, you had a couple of options. For a minor error, you could perhaps gently scrape or pat the area smooth and try again. But this risked distorting the surrounding text and was usually visible. For a major mistake, you might have to scrape a larger area, potentially losing significant text, or in the worst case, knead the entire tablet back into a ball rechisapet and start the whole thing over. Imagine spending an hour diligently impressing thousands of wedges, getting a paragraph almost perfect, and then messing up one sign badly. Yep, back to square one with the clay blob. This lack of easy correction probably encouraged careful planning before you started writing, and incredibly focused work while you were writing. It rewarded precision and foresight. You work with a steady rhythm. Press, lift, reposition. Press, lift, reposition. The surface fills row by row with intricate patterns of wedges. Because the clay needs to stay soft enough to accept impressions, you generally couldn't stop mid-tablet for a tea break and come back hours later, especially in the dry Mesopotamian heat. If the clay started to dry out while you were working on it, it would become hard to impress marks without cracking it. You probably needed to work relatively quickly or keep the clay slightly moist, perhaps with a damp cloth nearby, though concrete evidence for that specific technique is scarce. This need to complete a section, or perhaps the whole tablet before the clay hardened, could put pressure on the scribe, requiring focused, sustained effort. It wasn't a casual jotting process. A quirky or fringe tidbit about this process involves some of the very small tablets found. Some seem to be simple tags or labels attached to goods. Others are clearly practice pieces, but a few are incredibly small, perhaps just an inch or two across, containing very brief notes or calculations, executed with remarkable fineness using an incredibly sharp stylus corner. How they managed to write so tiny, so clearly on such a small piece of squishy clay, using what was essentially a reed pen, is quite impressive. It required extreme fine motor control and concentration. Imagine trying to sign your name legibly with the end of a chopstick on a piece of soft caramel. Kind of like that, but more important historically. Historians still argue whether complex multi-section tablets like lengthy contracts or literary works were typically finished by a single scribe in one intense session, or if they found ways to manage the clay drying process to allow for breaks or multiple scribes working on different sections sequentially. While smaller letters or administrative notes could certainly be done quickly, completing something like a large economic ledger or a multi-columned historical inscription might take considerable time. Did they cover the unworked parts with damp cloth, work on separate pieces that were later intended to be grouped, the logistics of extended writing projects on a medium with a limited working time, remain an area where direct evidence is patchy, requiring scholars to infer based on the physical state of unearthed tablets. It's another little historical mystery nestled within the everyday practicalities of the ancient world. So you keep pressing, forming the words of the letter, the lines of the contract, the list for the inventory. The silence, save perhaps for the distant city noise, would be punctuated by the quiet tap, 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 or the gentle schlorp, as the stylus is pressed and lifted from the yielding earth. This is the sound of ancient administration of trade of ideas being solidified for the future. The surface of the clay is no longer just a blank canvas. It is a network of intentional indentations, a physical representation of language. The tablet itself is transforming from a piece of mud into a carrier of meaning. Once the main message is complete on one side, if it's a longer text, you flip the tablet carefully, remember it's still soft, and continue writing on the reverse, managing your space to end neatly. For letters, you might leave space for a reply, or more likely for sending it away. Prepare it for the next crucial step in the Mesopotamian mail system, encasing it. All right, you've painstakingly completed the main body of your message on the soft clay tablet. You've pressed thousands of careful wedges, and your hand might be feeling a bit tired, perhaps dusted with fine clay. But if this is a private message like a business instruction or a personal communication that shouldn't be read by anyone except the intended recipient, you're not done. Here comes perhaps the most curious and distinctive feature of ancient Mesopotamian mail, the clay envelope. Yes, you read that right. They didn't wrap their letters in a thin sheet. They encased the entire clay tablet in a custom-fitted outer shell made of more clay. Imagine your postman having to deliver a solid fist-sized chunk of hardened mud just to hand you your latest bill or a note from Aunt Enlil. It seems utterly bizarre from a modern perspective where envelopes are thin, often translucent things. But the clay envelope served a crucial purpose, a historical function that makes perfect sense when you consider the time, the medium, and the lack of readily available tamper-evident seals, as we might recognize them. Why an envelope made of clay, simple security, and privacy? Your letter written on its inner tablet is made of soft clay. If someone intercepts it before it dries or is baked hard, they could simply smooth out the writing and impress a new message. Even if it's sun-dried, chipping away at parts and attempting forgery is possible, though difficult. But if you enclose that precious inner tablet inside a solid sealed layer of clay, suddenly reading the letter requires you to break the outer envelope. There was no subtle steaming it open and resealing it. To get to the message inside, you had to smash the outer layer to bits. This meant the recipient could be absolutely certain the message hadn't been tampered with during transit. If the outer envelope was intact, the message inside was exactly what the original scribe had written. If it was broken, well, someone had definitely intercepted and potentially read or altered it. The broken pieces of the outer envelope were themselves proof of tampering. It was the ancient equivalent of a tamper-evident seal, only much, much more robust and dirtier. This isn't just a quirky footnote, it's a mainstream historical fact found with countless administrative, legal, and personal letters from ancient Mesopotamia. We find tablets and envelopes routinely in excavations. The envelopes weren't used for every type of document. Long administrative lists or literary texts intended for archives weren't typically enveloped. But for communications where privacy or authenticity during transit was paramount, think contracts, business orders, letters containing sensitive information, or personal messages, the envelope was essential. It transformed a durable but potentially alterable record into a secure sealed communication. Imagine the effort. You've just finished writing a few hundred words, thousands of wedges on one clay tablet, which took skill and time. Now you need to make another layer of clay and meticulously build a custom container around it. It's like writing a letter, then wrapping the letter and your pen in clay, letting it dry, and sending the whole heavy package. It seems like overkill to us, but for thousands of years this was their high-security mailing system. Building this clay envelope required just as much care and proper material preparation as the inner tablet itself. You couldn't use brittle or impure clay. It needed to hold together during transit, but also be capable of being impressed with further important information on its outer surface. More on that later. So you'd take more refined, malleable clay and begin the process of carefully forming a shell around the finished inner tablet, which would ideally have dried slightly but might still be somewhat fragile. You don't want to press too hard and crack the message you just wrote. It's delicate work, like wrapping something precious in edible pastry dough, but less delicious. The need for security highlights something crucial about Mesopotamian society. Communication was valuable and potentially vulnerable. Trade routes were long, messengers faced hazards, and the information contained in a letter could be worth money or influence or hold sensitive instructions. Protecting that information while it was traveling from point A to point B was a real concern. The clay envelope was the ingenious, labor-intensive solution. It ensured that the communication chain, at least regarding message integrity, was robust. Anyone who touched it knew they couldn't casually glance at its contents without destroying the package. A quirky tidbit: some historians believe that the inner tablet wasn't completely dry when the outer envelope was formed. There might have been a slight difference in moisture content, so that when both layers eventually dried or were baked, they wouldn't shrink and expand exactly together, potentially preventing them from fusing entirely into a single solid block. Although this didn't always happen perfectly, this would theoretically make it slightly easier, though still requiring destruction, to separate the inner tablet from the broken outer shell after opening. Whether this was a deliberate technique or just a consequence of the process is part of the picture historians build, piece by piece. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of clay envelopes points primarily to concerns about message tampering by third parties, thieves, enemies, or simply to provide privacy from the courier carrying the letter. Given the sensitivity of some of the messages found in envelopes like financial contracts or royal decrees, both factors likely played a role. Couriers, even if trustworthy, could gain sensitive knowledge from the content. Encasing it kept the information sealed until it reached the intended recipient. The humble clay envelope, seemingly simple, opens up questions about security, trust, and information flow in the ancient world. Its very existence speaks volumes about what these people valued protecting. Crafting that outer layer, we'll see, was more than just molding mud. It was an act of securing vital communication. So the precious inner tablet containing your vital message pressed into clay is sitting there. It might be a bit drier than when you started, but still potentially fragile. Now comes the rather peculiar process of encasing it. You're building a custom shell literally around your finished document, using more of that same prepared clay. It's like making a pastry casing for a particularly durable and historically significant rock. You'd take fresh prepared clay, maybe flatten out a piece slightly larger than your inner tablet on your work surface. Then carefully lift the inner tablet and place it onto the piece of clay. Now, with small amounts of additional clay, you start building up the sides around the tablet. You might shape strips of clay or just mold lumps and gently press them against the edges and surfaces of the inner tablet, making sure the contact isn't too firm to distort the finished writing beneath, but firm enough that the fresh envelope clay adheres well. It's painstaking work. Imagine gently pressing soft Play-Doh around a biscuit without squishing the biscuit. Precision and patience were key. You're essentially forming a clay box or a solid shell with walls and a lid piece that completely encloses the inner tablet. You need to make sure there are no gaps or seams left open, otherwise the envelope's purpose is defeated. Someone could just peek or slide a tool in. The outer surface would be smoothed down again, creating a seamless casing. It wasn't usually a tight vacuum seal, of course. There would be a small space, the thickness of the original clay tablet, preserved inside the envelope once it dried. The inner tablet sat snugly but not fused within its earthen protective shell. The entire package, now consisting of the inner tablet and its outer clay envelope, was probably noticeably larger and heavier than the inner tablet alone. This reinforces that ancient mail wasn't lightweight or compact. Sending a lengthy report or multiple contracts would result in a seriously hefty package. Picture your letter carrier straining with a sack full of baseball-sized or even bigger clay lumps, a bit different from a standard paper envelope weighing negligible amounts. The skill here lay in molding the outer layer evenly and without damaging the inner message. You'd add clay pat it smooth, maybe use a scraper or paddle tool to ensure the surfaces were flat and the edges reasonably tidy. The finished clay envelope before it hardened needed to be a solid, smooth surface ready to receive inscriptions of its own. It couldn't be lumpy or uneven. Crucial information was about to be written on this outer surface. While you were forming this outer shell, the clay of the envelope had to remain soft and workable. This was another process requiring careful moisture control. If the clay was too dry, it wouldn't cohere properly into a sealed unit around the inner tablet. If it was too wet, it would be messy and wouldn't hold its shape well. Plus, you'd risk the inner tablet absorbing too much moisture and getting damaged or smeared. There was definitely an optimal consistency. It's quite likely that scribes had separate batches of prepared clay for inner tablets and outer envelopes, possibly slightly different in moisture content or refinement level, to make this intricate process work smoothly. A mainstream historical fact here is that the existence and widespread use of these envelopes for certain types of communication provide crucial evidence about the level of economic complexity and the need for secure transactions in Mesopotamian society. They didn't just trust verbal agreements or easily forgeable methods for important dealings. They invested significant extra effort in materials and labor to ensure the authenticity and privacy of their written communications when they left the point of origin. This suggests a sophisticated legal and commercial environment where proof and security mattered a great deal. A quirky or fringe tidbit is how tightly sealed these envelopes sometimes were. In some archaeological instances, the outer envelope and inner tablet were baked so thoroughly that they were essentially fused into one piece, making the intended method of reading. Breaking the outer layer incredibly difficult or even impossible without damaging the inner tablet. Sometimes the outer shell appears almost molded onto the inner, showing very little space between them. Whether this was intentional to provide even greater security, or an accidental result of storage conditions or firing intensity, isn't always clear, but it demonstrates the variability in the physical attributes of these ancient mail pieces. Historians still argue about the extent to which standard sizes or thicknesses were used for envelopes corresponding to inner tablets. While certain periods and institutions show some consistency, there's also significant variation. Was this based on practical limits of clay and drying times, traditional methods specific to certain scribal schools, or simply whatever thickness seemed necessary for adequate protection and surface area for the outer inscriptions, without clear written guidelines from the time? And let's face it, ancient instruction manuals are rarer than gold-plated chariots scholars have to rely on. Analyzing the thousands of surviving artifacts, measuring, weighing, and studying their composition to try and deduce ancient best practices. So the final padding and smoothing are done. The outer envelope is formed, completely encasing the inner message. You now have a sealed lump of clay. It's taking shape, feeling solid, but its surface is still pristine and unmarked. This new blank canvas on the outside of your sealed package is vital. It carries the crucial information about who the letter is, for perhaps a brief summary of what's inside, and most importantly, the proof of identity that made the letter official. That inscription on the outside is the focus next. Right, your message is sealed securely inside its custom-molded clay shell. You have this smooth blank clay envelope sitting in front of you waiting. It's hardened just enough to hold its shape firmly, but still soft enough to accept impressions. Now comes the part that makes sure your clay parcel actually reaches the right person, and that they know it's legitimate when they receive it. You address it and maybe give a hint about the contents. But you're not writing with a Sharpie. You're impressing into the still soft clay of the outer envelope using that same stylus, albeit perhaps more gently now that you're not worrying about intricate cuneiform signs of the main message, though. Sometimes abbreviations or keywords were impressed. The most important thing to impress on the outside was the recipient's name and address. Ancient Mesopotamian addresses weren't like ours. They didn't have street numbers and postal codes. An address might specify the city, perhaps the district within the city, like near the temple of God's name, or in the merchant quarter, and the name and title of the intended receiver. So you'd impress something like, to Nabubalagala, son of Sinikisha, residing in the Ababar temple precinct, Sipar, or to Idin Sin merchant whose house is by the east gate Writing these names and identifying details on the envelope was critical for the courier delivering it, and for the recipient confirming it was theirs. Besides the address, sometimes a brief summary or note about the contents was inscribed on the outer envelope. This served as a kind of ancient subject line or manifest. A scribe might write something like, "Concerning the sale of 10 sheep and 3 donkeys," or "Regarding the barley tax payment." For the field near the canal, or simply "Letter of Zimri Lim," the sender's name, or an identifier. This wasn't writing out the whole message again. It was a concise label allowing the recipient or someone handling the mail to know what the package was about without having to break it open. This summary served a practical purpose for sorting and prioritizing mail, especially in busy administrative centers or merchants' houses receiving numerous clay parcels. The act of inscribing these details on the outer envelope also further smoothed and compacted its surface. While the inner message might be dense with small wedges, the inscription on the outer envelope tended to be larger, clearer, and less intricate. It needed to be legible at a glance by a courier or sorting clerk who might not be as highly trained in reading cuneiform as the intended recipient scribe. So, simpler signs, more space between them. This layer of writing on the envelope reinforced its status as the official public face of the document during transit. It was what couriers and officials saw. The sensitive contents were hidden, only to be revealed upon delivery and destruction of this outer shell. It's a clear visual and physical separation between the secure private core and the public information necessary for transport. A mainstream historical fact illustrated by this outer inscription process is how developed administrative systems were in Mesopotamia. The ability to address mail to specific individuals living in specific areas, often including their father's name or title for disambiguation. Think of how many Nabus or Sins might live in one city. Speaks to complex population tracking and identification systems. They needed to reliably connect a lump of clay to a person living sometimes hundreds of miles away. A quirky tidbit is that sometimes the outer inscription itself contains subtle hints that were relevant only during transit. For example, an inscription might mention the route the courier was expected to take, or details relevant to customs checks or intermediate depots. These little clues embedded on the outer shell add another layer to understanding the logistics of ancient communication and travel. They show that the address wasn't just about the destination, but sometimes included operational details for the journey itself. Historians still argue whether there was a formal postal service structure managed by the state similar to later empires like the Romans or Persians, or if the system was predominantly one of individual or institutional messengers, perhaps using established trade networks or inns along routes. While royal and temple correspondence certainly seems to have been managed by official channels, commercial and personal letters might have relied more on private couriers or simply people traveling between destinations. The consistency of certain practices like enveloping suggests a widely understood if not centrally controlled system, but the precise organizational model for mail delivery remains an area of scholarly investigation based on the types of letters found and their origins destinations. It's another aspect of ancient life where the picture isn't entirely clear-cut. With the address and summary now pressed onto the soft outer clay, your secure message is almost ready to go. Almost. There's one more crucial step to finalize the document, adding the element of official authentication that was non-negotiable for important messages sealing it. Not with wax or glue, but with a special tool that was deeply personal and represented the sender's identity and authority. That's the story of the cylinder seal coming up. You've crafted the inner tablet and closed it within its protective clay envelope and impressed the recipient's address and a brief note on the outside. Now, for the final definitive step before handing off this earthy package for delivery, adding the official seal. In ancient Mesopotamia, signing a document or authenticating a letter wasn't done with a written signature like we do today, at least not in the way of writing your name in ink. It was done with a personal seal, and the preferred format for these seals was typically the cylinder seal. Think of a cylinder seal like a small, elaborately carved tube, often made of stone materials varied depending on status and wealth, from common limestone to more precious lapis lazuli, carnelian, or even hematite. The outside surface of the cylinder was carved with intaglio designs, patterns cut into the surface. These carvings were miniature works of art depicting everything from complex mythological scenes with gods and heroes, religious rituals, banquets, and hunting scenes, to simple geometric patterns or inscriptions naming the owner and their father or profession. Each seal design was unique or intended to be. This intricate carving, when rolled across a soft surface, would leave a continuous raised impression of the design, like rolling a tiny patterned rolling pin. The cylinder seal was deeply personal. It wasn't just a signature, it was often an object of significant value itself, sometimes worn on a string around the neck or wrist as jewelry. It represented the owner's identity, status, and authority. Losing your cylinder seal would be like losing your wallet, credit cards, and identity papers all at once, and then some to be sealless. Meant you couldn't authenticate documents or participate fully in many official or commercial transactions. Passing down seals through families was also a way of inheriting authority and identity. This personal connection to the seal is a key element of understanding its importance. For letters, especially important ones, and particularly for legal documents, contracts, or anything requiring authorization, the seal impression was absolutely critical. It was the ancient Mesopotamian equivalent of a signature and a notarization stamp combined. By rolling your unique seal across the clay, you were officially endorsing the document, agreeing to its terms, if a contract, or confirming that the letter originated from you and was authentic. Without the appropriate seal impression, the document likely wouldn't be considered valid or official. This requirement made seal usage widespread across all levels of society, engaging in formalized transactions. Merchants, administrators, priests, kings, even individuals signing personal agreements. This requirement for sealing is a mainstream historical fact that helps us understand the value they placed on authentication and personal responsibility in transactions. Every legally binding document unearthed from Mesopotamia bears the marks of cylinder seals. It's like a permanent record of handshake agreements solidified in clay. The vast number of seal impressions found on tablets has also given modern historians a treasure trove of art and iconography, providing insights into Mesopotamian beliefs, fashion activities, and even technology based on the scenes depicted on these tiny rolled pictures. The location of the seal impression on the clay package was usually strategic. For a sealed letter envelope, the seal would be rolled across the still, soft outer surface. Often the seal was rolled multiple times across different parts of the envelope. Across the seams where the clay joins were made around the edges, and across the flat faces, sometimes even covering much of the surface area, weaving around the address inscription. Rolling the seal across the seams was a deliberate technique to further secure the envelope and show clearly if someone had tried to open it along those edges before it dried. Any break in the continuous seal pattern was immediate visual proof of tampering. A quirky or fringe detail about this, sometimes multiple individual seals appear on a single document or envelope. This might happen on contracts where several witnesses or parties were involved. Seeing 2, 3, or even more unique seal impressions rolled onto the same clay surface speaks volumes about group participation and authentication in ancient agreements. Each person brought their personal identifier and officially signed the document by rolling their seal. Imagine a business contract today where, instead of multiple signatures, everyone involved literally brings their unique personal engraving device and stamps their approval into wax or soft plastic. Historians still argue about the exact protocol and legality surrounding lost or stolen seals. If someone else got hold of your seal, could they fraudulently authenticate documents in your name? Presumably yes, and some texts hint at legal processes involving verifying seal impressions or proclaiming a seal null and void if it was lost or stolen. This suggests there were systems in place to try and mitigate the risks associated with this primary method of identity and authentication. The very act of formally notifying authorities or others that your seal was lost indicates how seriously they took this matter. It wasn't just about preventing someone from borrowing your pretty necklace. So the sender or their representative takes the cylinder seal, maybe suspended on a string, carefully rolls it across the appropriate sections of the still pliable outer clay envelope, leaving a distinct and permanent impression of their personal mark. This physical act finalizes the letter's authenticity. The clay package, now inscribed, addressed, and officially sealed, is complete. It is no longer just a message. It's a sealed communication ready to begin its slow, uncertain journey. And that journey itself, carrying these heavy, delicate packages across ancient landscapes, was another logistical marvel.